Hello, everyone out there. I am Dr. Aparajita Hazra. I work as Dean of Humanities and Professor of English in Diamond Harbour University in India. Today, the title of my talk for the AHSN Symposium that I'm recording is of Magic and Monsters, Exploring Manucci's Magical India. I'll begin with a quote from Patterson, John Henry Patterson's book, The Man-Eaters of Savo and Other East African Adventures, which came out in 1907, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, I shall quote from a number of books today to make my point properly. Now, Patterson's book begins with a description of the new land, which is Africa in this case, which the characters of the story had arrived at. And he says, the narrator says, I was very much struck with the strange beauty of the view which gradually opened out before me. Contrary to my anticipation, everything looked fresh and green, and an oriental glamour of enchantment seemed to hang over the island. Now, this very awestruck wonder at oriental glamour of enchantment is what the West feels at the mention of the Orient. Now, let's zip back to the mid-17th century when an Italian named Niccolo Manucci, as he is alternately called, then all of a teenager, he followed his uncle aboard an English ship all the way to India. He lived in Delhi, where he learned Persian on the one hand and also the medical sciences on the other. This naturally, he later on became he made a place for himself almost as a physician in the court of the Mughals, who were then reigning over India. Manucci later joined the army of Dara Shikoh, who was the eldest son of Shah Jahan, Emperor Shah Jahan. And Niccolo Manucci also felt the same exotic pull of enchantment at the Indians and their so-called magical ways, in a way that was not always very positive. His magnum opus, which was titled Storia do Mogor, it was manuscripted somewhere in 1700 or 1701. It stands testimony to that very Orientalism. And Manucci was not the first to exoticize India in this way. At the very beginning of the 4th century BCE, Critias of Knidos published his treatise called the Indica, which was probably the first Greek book to be wholly dedicated to what was seen as the magical land of India, where he describes wondrous and exotic beings who are kind of like nothing short of abhuman at times. For example, he talks about the cyopods, who possess an enormous giant-sized foot that not only allows them to hop along with great speed, but also provides them with shelter from the sun if they're lying on their back. Pliny the Elder talks of the descriptions of wondrous beings by Critias, and he says, and I quote from Pliny, he says, Critias writes of a tribe of men without necks and with eyes in their shoulders. That's Indian. That's Indians for Critias and also for Pliny. Megasthenes too had described amazing but very strange beings in India that he professes to have seen. Like he talked about men who lived on a certain Mount Newless, who had their feet reversed and also had 8 toes on each foot. He also describes, and I quote from him, on the mountains, there are men with dogs' heads who are covered with wild beast skins. They bark instead of talking or speaking and live by hunting and fowling, for which they use their nails. Among the nomads of India is a race called Skiritai that has only holes in place of nostrils like snakes and has bandy legs. At extreme boundaries of India, to the east near the source of the Ganges, are the Astame, who have no mouth and whose body is covered in hair. They dress in cotton wool and live only on the air they breathe and the odor they draw in through their nostrils. Beyond the Astame, also in the depth of the mountains, so the story goes, live the Tripistemi and the Pygmies, In height, they do not exceed 3 spans, that is about 2.5 feet. Now, coming back to Niccolò Manucci, that was what Pliny was talking about Megasthenes describing the Indians. Now, coming back to Niccolò Manucci, the focal point of my lecture today, an excerpt from his Storia de Mogor, the book I mentioned, this magnum opus, would vouch for his attitude to the India that he professes to have known, he describes. He says, I could never sufficiently state to what an extent the Hindus and the Mohammedans in India are in the habit of practicing witchcraft. The reader should know that these people are for the most part magicians and have a compact with the devil. That is from Storia de Mogor, volume 3. Immediately after recounting stories of magic and witchcraft allegedly practiced by these Indians who are in a pact with the devil, Manucci goes on to describe them as almost bestial and uncivilized. He calls the Pathans or the Pashtuns ferocious, barbarous, uncouth, unruly, unbelieving Mohammedans. You know, these are adjectives that I'm directly actually quoting from his book. While the Arakan people, you know, Arakan at that point of time, now it's in Burma, but earlier it used to be in the Indian subcontinent. He describes them as barbarous as the tigers, elephants, rhinoceroses, and buffaloes which dwell in the jungles. So it's very clear that he's describing the Indian people in terms of bestiality, in terms of animal-like attitude and animal-like behavior. For the people living in Nasik, which is in Maharashtra, he says that the habits of these people are barbarous, their features ugly, and complexion black. They go almost naked, having only a simple cloth, which at times is insufficient to hide their shame. On the Saids, which are who are the Muslim holy men in India, he also talks about them in very denigrating terms, saying that they can, you know, put people under their spells through incantations which they perform with the aid of the devil, with the help of the devil. Now, Indians, according to Manucci, are unabashedly promiscuous too. You know, they are womanizers, they are promiscuous too, according to Manucci. And he says, above all, they have control of the women who resort to them in large numbers. They know how to make use of their opportunities, sparing neither Mohammedan, Hindu, nor Christian women if they are good looking. In addition, they have numerous wives and slave girls in their houses, whom they send out at night in all directions as pretended devotees to earn an illicit livelihood, or to act as go-betweens to bring to the house of their master any woman that he desires. Now, this trend of demeaning and denigrating the Orient as magic-toting, magic-happy brood, who were to be seen as a race of freakish and subhuman species who toted attributes and features that were not even human, was not very new with Manucci then, because the tradition was well there, as is evident from the references to Cetius, Megasthenes, and Pliny that I had made earlier. And Manucci was evidently just drawing from it. And this tradition of projecting India as a land of magical people who were almost a freak show of sorts for the enlightened Western eye was carried over from Manucci too into later authors like Bernier and Tavernier. Now, François Bernier wrote the Histoire, which was published in Paris in 1670 to 1671. Now, Erwin Brock, he was actually an English merchant banker, and he translated it into English under the title of Travels in the Mughal Empire. This came out in 1826. Now, there we find that Bernier's memoirs include a letter to a Monsieur Chapelain. He spells Chapelain as Chapelain. So he writes a letter to the Monsieur Chapelain, which is subtitled Describing the Superstitions, Strange Customs, and Doctrines of the Hindus. He spells it Indous, not Hindus, but Hindus. But we can understand that he was probably talking about the Hindus. So this is of the doctrines of the Hindus or Gentiles of Hindustan. There again, he describes the Hindus engaged in a religious ritual on the banks of the Jamna. He spells Jamna as Gemna, which we Indians spell as Yamuna, but he calls it Jamna during an eclipse. Uh, and he describes the rituals that the Indians are performing in terms that quite looked down on the Indians and their ways as a display of inscrutable magical rites that made no sense at all to the Western logic. He says, and I quote, "The deluded people continue to plunge, mutter, pray, and perform their silly tricks until the end of the eclipse." Another thing that he describes is the Ratha Yatra. In India, the festival of Ratha Yatra is celebrated yearly, where the Lord Jagannatha, who is an avatar of Lord Vishnu or Krishna, is taken out on an enormous and beautifully embellished chariot on his annual tour of the land before he is reinstated inside his temple once again. This ceremony is even today revered as one of the most holy festivals of the Indians. But Bernier's description of the ceremony, which to Indians is just as sacred as Eucharist Mass would be to a Christian, is replete with superciliousness and a lot of disdain. After describing what he calls an absurd ceremony, he goes on to talk of the rituals of the Lord Jagannath, widely celebrated even today in Puri, in Odisha, towards the mid-eastern part of India, in very demeaning terms. He says, and I quote from Bernier, "And while the chariot of hellish triumph pursues its solemn march, persons are found so blindly credulous and so full of wild notions as to throw themselves upon the ground in a way of its ponderous wheels, which pass over and crush to atoms the bodies of the wretched fanatics without exciting the horror or surprise of the spectators." Again, about the yogis. To an Indian educated from childhood in the age-old spiritual essence of India and the religious texts like Advaita, Vedanta, and the Vedas, the significance of the spiritual exercise of the Indian saints, known as the yogis, is immense. Their renunciative principle in life that requires them to lay off all connections to material belongings and test themselves rigorously for command over their senses and their emotions through extreme measures like meditating while sitting on a corpse or on the ashes of a cremated corpse, the greatest trigger of fear and aporia. All these make absolute sense to an Indian who knows the tradition. But Bernier describes the Indian yogis in very unflattering terms. Bernier, who is ignorant of the spiritual raison d'etre for the ways of these yogis or sadhus, dismisses them summarily as diabolical and bizarre. And he says, I quote from him, "I allude particularly to the people called the Jogis." He spells Jogis as Jauguis, not the Indian way of spelling Yogis. So he says that I allude particularly to the people called the Yogis, a name which signifies united to God. Numbers are seen day and night, seated or lying naked, frequently under large trees near talabs or tanks of water, or the galleries around the deuras or idol temples. Some have hair hanging down to the calf of the leg, twisted and entangled into knots like the coat of shaggy dogs, or rather with the hair of those afflicted with the Polish disease, which we called la plie. I have seen several who hold one or some who hold both arms perpetually lifted above the head, and no fury in the infernal regions can be conceived more horrible than the yogis with their naked and black skin, long hair, spindle arms, long twisted nails, and fixed in the posture which I have mentioned. For Bernier, then, ignorance about the ways of India and her deeply spiritual philosophies, like in the as propounded in the Vedanta or in the Vedas, was compounded with a sense of white supremacy, and that translated into a derision and disdain, which clearly was inspired by a judgment which was clouded by the very Western concept of what civilization means, and which is punctuated by good and neat clothing and personal grooming and fondness for white skin, a disdain that othered Indians as the freak, the uncouth, the monster. So inferior does Bernier consider this 5,000-year-old civilization like India, that any possibility of comparison with the West seems anathema to him. So he very sarcastically says, but what appears truly ridiculous is their impertinent comparison of themselves with our own clergy in the Indies. I have sometimes derived much amusement from their weakness and vanity. One would here immediately remember Manucci, Niccolò Manucci, again, the focal point of my lecture. Niccolò Manucci's denigrating words when he had set the religious practices of native Indians against a glorified view of Christianity. And in his Storia de Mogor, towards the beginning, he said, it will be seen that their religion is nothing but a confused mixture of absurdities and coarse imaginings, unworthy even of the rational man. By referring to Indians as bizarre, unintelligible, and corporally grotesque, almost to the point of being dangerous and unheimlich, the West then creates an imaginary magical cultural space, which is almost like a Foucauldian heterotopia that is very exotic in its unfathomability and incomprehensibility to the Western mind. Judith Butler probably would call this a cultural heterotopia, a domain of what she calls unlivability and unintelligibility. Now, the monsters, or rather the monsterized Indians living in the liminal beyond the horizon space, are unintelligible to the Western eye and thus evoke epistemological fantasies. The West has often characterized the other with a capital O, as weird, abnormal, magical, inexplicable, and sometimes even abhuman. It was the imperial gaze that transfixed the Orient as the monster. It was what John Berger would call the ways of seeing, and the ways of seeing almost running rampant without really the Orient being organized enough to gaze back. So the Orient was gazed by the West, but it was not organized enough to gaze back. The empire never wrote back. Now, John Watson Mackrindle, who's a 19th century historian, he says that these races of monstrous and abhuman Indians described by Cetius and Pliny are nothing other than indigenous tribes who refuse to bow down to the colonization by the West. And that's why they were misrepresented as the monstrous other by the colonizing West. One has to remember that for the Europeans too, the countries like India were territories of new discovery, where the extreme climates and the different people were a sight of wonder and a sight of the unknown and the intriguing. And that, compounded with the European sense of superiority, made room for monstering the same other as the inferior, inscrutable, different, abject. Evidently, the denormalizing, or if not the dehumanizing, of the Indians as a magic toting breed of people who were wallowing in their own empirical shallowness and their prevalence of magic and the dark arts, all of which contested the scientific temper propagated by the Western Aufklärung or the Enlightenment. And all of this, the monsterizing or the othering of the Orient, kind of like seemed to help the justifying the imperial enterprise. True enough, all this while the inhabitants of India never wrote back, at least not in the languages that the West would understand, the language that the world would understand. India did have a very rich literary and spiritual culture that was there in Sanskrit and Persian. Even when translations of these texts were done, they were done by the foreigners, they were done by the Europeans, thereby leaving enough room for the gaps and politics of representation to creep in. It was only in the 19th century, when the Indian Renaissance happened, that English came to be taught to the Indians. And then, of course, they started writing back. They started writing their own discourses. But by then, the Orientalist discourse of India as a land of magic and exoticism, that defied logic, had already been embedded in the Western imaginary. So that's it from my end. Thank you very much. I hope I have been completely audible, and I'll sign out now. Thank you.